Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. The sun had barely lifted above the Maryland hills when a Union corporal of the 27th Indiana Infantry stumbled across something strange in the grass. His name was Barton W. Mitchell. What he found seemed ordinary at first, 3 cigars wrapped in a slip of paper. But as he unrolled the wrapper, he froze. The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Robert E. Lee. The paper was no trivial note. It was a dispatch, General Order 191, outlining the precise movements of Lee's scattered army. Troop positions, supply routes, even the Confederate plan to strike toward Washington lay exposed in Mitchell's hands. By sheer chance, the Union had been handed its enemy's playbook. The order was rushed up the chain of command until it reached General George B. McClellan. He read it once, then again, then a third time. Here was the moment every commander dreams of: foreknowledge, a map into the enemy's intentions. And yet, McClellan faltered. Memories of Richmond still clung to him. The failed Peninsula campaign, his retreat under pressure, the bitter chorus of critics who called him timid, unfit, too slow to seize opportunity. Now, holding Lee's plan, McClellan found himself staring at destiny and wondering if he dared to grasp it. The stakes could not have been higher. By September 1862, the Union was bleeding from a year of war. Hopes of a quick victory had turned into a grinding conflict that devoured lives. In the South, Confederate victories emboldened secession and drew the gaze of Britain and France, nations dependent on Southern cotton and considering recognition of Jefferson Davis's government. For Lincoln, the pressure was immense. His enemies whispered of incompetence. His allies demanded results. If Lee triumphed again, this time on Northern soil, foreign powers might intervene, and the Union itself might fracture beyond repair. And so, the fate of the nation rested on the desk of a man both brilliant and cautious, a general often described as methodical, deliberate, and fatally indecisive. McClellan had in his grasp the chance to end the war in a single campaign. Whether he would act swiftly or once again let the moment slip was the question that hung over Antietam before the first shot was fired. The clash that would become Antietam was born not in a grand capital, but in the rolling farmland of western Maryland, a quiet countryside of cornfields, stone bridges, and whitewashed churches. After the hard fighting at South Mountain, Robert E. Lee gathered his battered divisions near the small town of Sharpsburg. The ground offered him natural defenses: Antietam Creek at his front, ridges and farm lanes to anchor his lines, and the Potomac River at his back. Still, it was a perilous position. His army was exhausted, many men shoeless, short of food, some even fainting from hunger. Yet Lee had no thought of retreat. He would stand here and fight. Across the creek, George B. McClellan held the initiative but seemed unable to wield it. Though Lee's force was scattered and vulnerable in the hours after South Mountain, the Union commander lingered. He inspected, he reorganized, he issued and reissued orders. 2 full days passed before the Army of the Potomac closed in on Sharpsburg. What should have been a swift pursuit turned into another pause, another lost chance. Critics would later say McClellan let the fire go out of the iron while it was still hot. By the afternoon of September 16th, Union soldiers at last crossed Antietam Creek. Major General Joseph Hooker led the First Corps across the shallow waters, skirmishing with Confederate pickets near the East Woods. Cannon smoke drifted over the hills as shots cracked among fences and orchards. The noise carried into Sharpsburg itself, where civilians crouched in cellars, whispering prayers. Lee, watching from the ridges, saw the meaning instantly. The enemy was massing on his left. He responded with cold precision, assigning that flank to his fiercest lieutenant, Thomas Stonewall Jackson, whose reputation from the Valley Campaign made even weary men straighten at his name. To the center he gave James Longstreet, dependable and deliberate, and in the gaps he scattered cavalry to harass any breakthrough. That night, both armies lay within earshot of one another. On the Union side, campfires flickered across the hills, men eating hastily from tin plates, some scribbling farewell notes under lantern light. On the Confederate side, soldiers lay down hungry, their stomachs growling louder than the pickets' rifles. Jackson himself was seen kneeling in prayer beneath a tree, lips moving silently while the firelight danced on his gaunt face. The fields of corn and pasture, so peaceful at sunset, would by dawn become killing grounds, and every man knew it. "Tomorrow will be a day to remember," one soldier muttered into the darkness. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm. On the eve of battle, George B. McClellan unveiled the strategy he believed would undo Robert E. Lee. It was not the thunderclap of a single overwhelming strike, but a calculated rhythm, an echelon assault. The idea was deceptively simple. Hooker's corps would hit first on the Union right, then Mansfield's men would attack the center. Next came Sumner, driving fresh brigades into the fight. And finally, Ambrose Burnside on the left would deliver the decisive blow, crashing into Sharpsburg itself. Each assault was meant to follow the last, like hammer strokes on an anvil, forcing the Confederates to shift their reserves again and again until their line cracked under pressure. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it required perfect timing and relentless coordination. Every corps had to move forward in sequence, no hesitation, no confusion. If the rhythm broke, the plan would dissolve into fragments. Military historians later compared it to Napoleonic maneuvers at Austerlitz or Wagram, rolling waves of pressure designed to break an opponent's balance. But Napoleon had been ruthless in execution. McClellan, by contrast, was often paralyzed by overanalysis. He feared the unseen trap more than he trusted his own advantage. His tendency was not to seize the moment, but to wait, to measure, to double-check until the chance was already gone. Even before dawn, cracks appeared. Orders moved slowly. Some brigades were marched back and forth through the night until men collapsed from fatigue. Reserves intended to be fresh were pushed forward at 2:30 a.m., given barely 2 hours to lie in the mud before being told to prepare for battle. The clockwork assault McClellan had imagined was already running late. For the soldiers, strategy meant little. They felt only the uncertainty, wandering through fog, unsure of where they were needed, unsure of what dawn would bring. By lantern light, some scrawled hasty letters to loved ones, sealing them with trembling hands. Others sat in silence, cleaning their muskets over and over, as if repetition might shield them from what was coming. The echelon was meant to be a storm, relentless, unbroken, inevitable. Instead, even before the sun rose, it already felt fractured. And as Antietam dawned, the question was not whether the plan could succeed, but whether McClellan had the will to keep it moving forward. As darkness settled over Sharpsburg, the armies prepared for a dawn that promised slaughter. But for the men in blue and gray, the night before Antietam brought no rest. It was a night of disorder, marching, and gnawing fear. McClellan's grand plan, so carefully drawn on maps, was already fraying in execution. Orders were misdirected, countermanded, and delayed. Brigades shuffled back and forth across muddy farm lanes, men stumbling in exhaustion. Some regiments marched for hours only to be told they were in the wrong place. By 2:30 in the morning, Hooker's supposed fresh reserves were finally in position. Too late to sleep, too early to recover. They lay on their arms in the damp grass, eyes staring into the fog, waiting for dawn's trumpet. The night carried a strange unreality. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies as officers barked contradictory commands. Wagons rattled across stones, sparks flashing from iron rims. A thin mist clung to the ground, muffling sound and blurring shapes. Soldiers moved through it like sleepwalkers, trapped in a dream where the next step might be into death. Some men tried to write by candlelight. Farewell lines scratched onto scraps of paper, smudged with sweat and dirt. "If tomorrow I fall," one private scrawled to his mother, "remember me kindly, for I thought of home to the last." Others prayed aloud, voices low, mingling with the restless neigh of horses and the cough of musket fire from distant pickets. Across the creek, the Confederates were no less restless. Jackson's veterans, many hollow-cheeked and barefoot, tried to sleep with empty stomachs. They had not eaten since morning. Their general, as was his habit, knelt in silent prayer beneath a tree. In the firelight, his men watched him, feeling both reassured and unsettled, as though he communed with some force beyond the battlefield. For the civilians of Sharpsburg, the night was one of dread. Families huddled in cellars while stray bullets cracked in the dark. Farmers knew the fields they had planted in spring would by tomorrow be trampled into mud and blood. When at last the eastern sky began to pale, it revealed an army already weary, already frayed. Neither side had slept, neither side felt ready. The night had offered not rest, but confusion. Confusion that would soon erupt into the most savage day America had ever seen. At first light, the northern fields glistened with dew. Rows of corn swayed gently, their tassels catching the pale sun. To anyone but the soldiers, it might have seemed a morning of peace. But the men of Joseph Hooker's First Corps knew better. The cornfield ahead was about to become a furnace. At 5:43 a.m., Hooker gave the signal. Blue-coated ranks advanced south, their eyes fixed on a small whitewashed church, the Dunker Church, standing solitary against the horizon. They believed they were outflanking the enemy. Instead, within half an hour, they collided headlong with Stonewall Jackson's corps, concealed among the corn and the woods. Two armies, each convinced it was turning the other's flank, crashed together in the middle of that field. The clash was instant, furious. At first, the Union surged, driving the Confederates out of the east woods and pressing them back toward the west woods. Union artillery unlimbered on the ridges, 26 guns roaring, shells tearing into stalks and men alike. The smoke was so thick that soldiers could not see 10 feet ahead. One recalled, "The air seemed alive with lead. Inside the cornfield, it was chaos beyond comprehension. Musket balls hissed like hornets. Corn stalks were shredded until they toppled in rows, indistinguishable from the men who fell beside them." Survivors later said the field seemed to writhe as if alive, bullets cutting through stalks and flesh together. A private remembered looking for the enemy and seeing only a wall of smoke and fire. Still, Hooker's men pressed forward. Major General James Ricketts hurled his brigades into the fray, smashing through 7 Confederate brigades. Jackson's famous Stonewall Division staggered, its reputation cracking under the sheer weight of fire. For a moment, the Confederate flank was buckling, and yet the field was no victory ground. It was a slaughter pen. Confederates clung to the west woods, their artillery on Nicodemus Hill pounding the Federals, their stubborn volleys cutting gaps in the blue lines. Men fell so thickly that Hooker later wrote, "They lay in rows as they had stood in ranks a few minutes before." By mid-morning, the cornfield had changed hands multiple times. No soil was visible, only stalks shredded to pulp, the ground churned with mud and blood. What had begun as a farmer's pride was now a graveyard. The Union had almost cracked Lee's left wide open. Almost. And that single word, almost, would haunt the day at Antietam. For a brief, breathless moment, it looked as though Stonewall Jackson's flank would collapse. 7 brigades had been shattered under Ricketts' onslaught, the proud Stonewall Division itself reduced to fragments. Smoke blanketed the field so thick that even Jackson's veterans could no longer see the banners guiding them. One officer admitted later, "We were falling to pieces, and the ground was slipping from beneath us. If McClellan's grand plan was ever to work, it was here, Jackson on the ropes, his flank open to be rolled up." But Antietam was not a battlefield that offered easy victories. Lee still had cards to play. Reinforcements appeared. John Bell Hood's division. These were no fresh troops, but gaunt, hollow-eyed men, many without shoes, their gray uniforms hanging like rags. That morning, they had been frying beef for breakfast when the order came to march. They left their food sizzling in the pans and plunged straight into the fight. Hood himself later described his soldiers as mad as wolves, starved as wolves, and in that desperate rage lay their strength. With a rebel yell that carried across the fields, Hood's Texans and Alabamians surged into the cornfield. The shock was immediate. Hooker's exhausted men, who moments before had been driving Jackson's line backward, suddenly faced a fresh onslaught. Bayonets gleamed in the haze, muskets flashed at close range, and the cornfield once again turned into a maelstrom. The Union's Iron Brigade tried to wheel around Hood's flank, but the Texans met them with ferocity that seemed inhuman. One Union officer later confessed, "They did not look like men, but like specters risen from the grave." Artillery shells tore the ground, blasting friend and foe alike. The corn stalks, already shredded, were flattened entirely. Men fired blindly through smoke, reloading as fast as trembling hands would allow, thrusting bayonets when the lines met in hand-to-hand fury. By the time the smoke cleared, the cornfield was no longer anyone's. Hood had stopped the Union advance, but at a ghastly cost. His division was wrecked, reduced to shadows of their former strength. Asked later where his command was, Hood gave a grim reply. Dead on the field. Jackson's flank had held, but only just. The moment for a clean Union breakthrough had passed. What remained was something worse, a battle of attrition, a tug of war over ground where men fell by the hundreds for each row of corn. The Union had struck hard, and the Confederates had struck back. Neither side had won. Both had only bled. By mid-morning, the cornfield was no longer a field at all. It was a churned wasteland, stalks shredded into pulp, the soil black with powder and red with blood. The fight had become a brutal tug of war, each side hurling fresh men into the maelstrom, only to see them vanish in smoke and carnage. Hooker's battered corps received support from the Iron Brigade of Wisconsin, tall Midwestern farmers in their black hardy hats, grim and unshakable. They advanced with cold determination, pivoting around Hood's flank and pouring disciplined volleys into the Confederates. For a moment, it looked as if the Texans would be swept away, but Hood's survivors clung stubbornly to the West Woods, answering volley with volley. One Union officer wrote later, "It was as though we were caught in a threshing machine. Men went down in groups, not singly, and the very stalks fell as if reaped with us. The battle surged back and forth. Confederates countercharged, Federals surged again, and once more the lines dissolved into chaos. The cornfield changed hands repeatedly, sometimes twice within an hour. Soldiers joked grimly that if you wanted to know who held the ground, you need only look at the color of the dead lying upon it. Artillery fire made the slaughter even worse. Shells burst overhead, raining iron down on both friend and foe. The air was filled with acrid smoke and the screams of wounded men begging for water. An officer of the 7th Wisconsin remembered seeing bodies strewn as if by some great scythe. Blue and gray mingled so close they seemed brothers. By 10 o'clock, both sides were shattered. Hood's division was nearly gone, the Iron Brigade reduced to a shadow of its former strength. Yet neither army had gained the cornfield. It lay in ruin, claimed by no one. The field itself became the perfect symbol of Antietam, courage beyond question, sacrifice beyond measure, and yet no decision. Just blood, smoke, and silence where victory should have been. While Hooker's corps reeled from the struggle in the cornfield, the next wave of McClellan's echelon was meant to strike. General Joseph K. Mansfield, commanding the 13th Corps, was ordered to push into the center and relieve the pressure. Mansfield was 60 years old, a veteran of decades in uniform but a stranger to field command. For many of his men, raw recruits who had never faced a musket volley, he was the steady figure meant to give them confidence. Yet on that morning, uncertainty stalked his every step. Reports reached him that Hooker's advance was faltering, that Confederate counterattacks were surging through the cornfield. Should he dig in? Should he rush to reinforce Hooker? The fog of war offered no clarity. His soldiers looked to him for certainty, but Mansfield himself seemed torn, hovering between caution and duty. Then came the tragic twist. As he rode forward to steady his line, Mansfield approached a fence. His horse balked at the jump, forcing the general to dismount and lead it around. In that awkward moment, exposed in the smoky half-light, he became a target. A shot rang out. Mansfield slumped, blood blooming through his chest. His aides rushed to him, but the wound was mortal. Most chilling of all, the fatal bullet likely came not from a Confederate, but from one of his own men, mistaking him for an enemy officer in the chaos. Friendly fire, born of fear and confusion, had cut down the very man meant to hold the line. As word spread, Mansfield's corps faltered. Soldiers who had marched forward with nervous resolve now hesitated, unsure whether to entrench or advance. The momentum McClellan had envisioned dissolved. Once again, the Union's hammerstroke had splintered before it landed. For the men who saw their general carried from the field, the sight was crushing. One soldier recalled, "It seemed to us that hope itself had fallen with him. In a battle already defined by chaos, Mansfield's death became another cruel emblem, a commander lost not to the enemy's brilliance, but to the blindness of war itself. Even as Mansfield was carried from the field, calamity struck again. Joseph Hooker, bold, brash, and beloved by many of his men for his fearless energy, was directing the fight when a bullet tore through his foot. At first, he waved it off, trying to stay mounted, shouting that it was nothing. But blood quickly soaked his boot, and the pain forced him to admit defeat. Furious, Hooker was lifted from his saddle and carried to the rear, cursing that he would not leave his men. With Hooker gone, the First Corps, already battered from the Cornfield, was left in confusion. Command passed to General Alpheus Williams, a competent officer, but one who had no clear grasp of McClellan's overall design. He had received no detailed plan, no timetable, no sense of the larger rhythm. The echelon assault, already stumbling, now lost yet another beat. The effect on morale was immediate. Soldiers who had fought with grim determination now looked around and saw chaos. Their first commander had been carried off on a stretcher. Mansfield lay dying, and still no one seemed to know what the next move was. "We had strength to fight," one Wisconsin private later wrote, "but no head to guide us." The fighting continued out of sheer inertia. Units launched piecemeal attacks. Others dug in, still others drifted without orders. The Confederates, bloodied but unbroken, held their ground in the West Woods and along the ridges near Dunker Church. What should have been a coordinated push turned into scattered thrusts, each one absorbed and repelled. Hooker's fall was more than the loss of a general. It was the loss of cohesion. In an army already plagued by delay and hesitation, the sudden vacuum of leadership deepened the fracture. McClellan, back at headquarters, had drawn lines and arrows on maps. But on the battlefield itself, those lines had disintegrated into smoke and confusion. The Union soldiers kept fighting because that was all they could do. But without their commanders, they were like a ship tossed on waves without a rudder. The cornfield and the woods had devoured leaders as well as men, and the Union right was left grasping for direction in the midst of chaos. McClellan's echelon plan was meant to be a rolling drumbeat, each blow falling before the enemy could recover. But by late morning, the rhythm had already collapsed. Hooker was gone, Mansfield lay dying, and the next stroke, Sumner's Second Corps, was nowhere to be seen. General Edwin Vos Sumner was a soldier of another age. 65 years old, scarred from earlier wars, his men called him Bullhead after a musket ball once bounced harmlessly off his skull. Brave to a fault, he believed in leading from the front, even when prudence suggested otherwise. But at Antietam, his arrival was disastrously mistimed. The Second Corps should have been on the field by 7:30 a.m., crashing into Jackson's buckling left and tipping the balance. Instead, confusion and poor communication kept Sumner's columns marching in circles. Not until well past 8:30 did his men begin filtering into the fight. By then, Hood's ferocious counterattack had stabilized the Confederate line, and the fleeting window of opportunity was already closing. When Sumner finally advanced, he led his men in person, galloping ahead with saber raised. His attack, however, unfolded not as a single hammer strike but in fragments. Divisions entered piecemeal, each thrown into the storm without coordination. One officer later wrote bitterly, "We struck them not as a thunderbolt, but as drizzle upon dust, dissipating before it could take hold." At Dunker Church, Sumner's men tried to link up with Hooker's shattered survivors, but Confederate fire from the West Woods cut them down. Instead of overwhelming Jackson, the Union brigades hurled themselves forward one after another, only to be flung back in ruin. The fight devolved into isolated struggles, brave but futile, against a Confederate line that bent but did not break. Lee seized the moment. From his reserves, thin as they were, he shifted brigades to reinforce Jackson. Every delay on the Union side gave Lee more time to patch the holes with flesh and blood. By mid-morning, the Second Corps had committed thousands of men to the field, but their power had been spent in fragments, not as a decisive wave. Sumner's courage was unquestioned. His timing was catastrophic. What might have been the breaking point of Lee's army instead hardened into a stalemate. The echelon was no longer a rhythm at all. It was a series of missed beats, each one leaving the Confederates still standing. By mid-morning, the West Woods became the hinge on which the battle turned. Sumner's divisions, thrown forward late and in fragments, pushed through the trees believing the enemy was broken. In truth, they were walking into a carefully laid trap. Robert E. Lee had read the rhythm of the Union attacks with uncanny clarity. He saw McClellan's echelon unraveling, not a steady tide, but scattered surges without coordination. Jackson's flank had bent but held, and Lee knew exactly where to strike. He fed reinforcements into the West Woods, brigades under Lafayette McLaws, John Walker, and others, slipping them into the cover of trees until they formed a hidden fist. When Sumner's men advanced deeper, the fist struck. Confederate lines erupted from the woods with a sudden roar, muskets flashing at near point-blank range. One Union soldier recalled, "They came on like a storm bursting from the trees, firing and yelling as if the forest itself had come alive." The effect was devastating. Federal regiments staggered under the shock, their ranks torn apart by volleys from the front and flanks. General John Gorman, caught in the maelstrom, later confessed, "The attack upon our flank was so sudden, in such overwhelming force, that we had no time to lose." Men who had marched forward with confidence now broke in panic, retreating through the same woods they had just claimed. In minutes, the West Woods was a slaughter ground. Blue-coated Federals fled more than 200 yards, leaving behind shattered brigades and abandoned guns. Survivors later described the forest floor as carpeted with men as thick as leaves. For the Confederates, the counterattack carried a fierce momentum. Brigades advanced in splendid style, cheering as they drove the Federals back. For Lee, it was vindication, proof that even when outnumbered, his army could seize the initiative. For McClellan, it was another missed stroke. The hammer blow meant to smash the Confederate left had instead rebounded, leaving his army bloodied and disorganized. The West Woods belonged to Lee now, and in that reclaimed ground lay the grim truth of Antietam. Opportunities on the Union side were fleeting, but Lee's ability to exploit them was relentless. By late morning, Antietam had become a battle of fragments. The cornfield was strewn with bodies, the West Woods lost to a sudden Confederate counterattack, and the Union's right hung in disarray. Then came the arrival of fresh troops, General William B. Franklin's 6th Corps, marching onto the field with banners high, their uniforms still clean, their spirits unbroken. For a moment, Union soldiers thought salvation had arrived. Franklin was eager to strike. He saw the chaos in front of him as an opportunity. "Give me the word," he insisted, "and I will drive them back into the river." But what he found instead of orders was confusion. Retreating soldiers from Sumner's corps clogged the roads, shouting that the West Woods were a death trap, that the Confederates had swallowed entire brigades. Franklin's men looked upon the fugitives and realized they were marching into a storm, not a victory. Here the fractures within Union command deepened. Franklin argued to counterattack, to seize back momentum before Lee could regroup. Sumner, shaken from his corps' mauling, demanded the opposite: entrench, hold ground, stop the bleeding. Their dispute became so heated that aides recorded the shouting match. "You would throw away your corps in an hour," Sumner roared. Franklin snapped back, "And you would throw away a victory." McClellan himself rode forward to settle the matter, but instead of boldness, he chose restraint. Ever cautious, he ordered Franklin to secure the high ground and protect the lines of communication rather than press the assault. Once again, the drumbeat of the echelon broke down into silence. The cost was not just tactical, it was psychological. Soldiers who had marched with confidence now sat idle, waiting, while the enemy across the field licked its wounds and reformed. One Union officer later wrote bitterly, "We stood with muskets in hand, watching the chance for triumph fade like smoke in the air. By noon, both sides were bleeding but unbroken. The Union had the numbers but lacked cohesion. The Confederacy had no reserves left but clung to ground with ferocious tenacity. The battle, which had begun with flashes of opportunity, hardened into something colder, deadlock. The morning promise of a decisive Union breakthrough had been squandered." Antietam was no longer a contest of maneuver. It was becoming a war of attrition, measured not in miles gained, but in lives lost. By midday, the struggle shifted to the very heart of Lee's line, a simple country lane that locals had used for decades to haul wagons of corn and hay. Worn deep by years of wheels and hooves, it had sunken into the earth, its banks rising like ready-made walls. On September 17, 1862, this humble farm road became a fortress and a grave. Confederate General D.H. Hill lined the sunken road with roughly 2,600 men. Nestled behind the natural embankments, they formed a living parapet, muskets resting on the rim. From this position, they could rake any Union advance with merciless fire. Hill himself would later say the road was a natural rifle pit, stronger than anything we could have built. The first to test it was General William French's division of the Union Second Corps. They advanced steadily up the slope, only to be shattered by the storm that erupted from the road. Volley after volley tore through their ranks, men falling in sheets. A survivor recalled, "They fell not singly, but in groups, mowed down as if by one great scythe." Then came the Irish Brigade, led by General Thomas Meagher. Wearing sprigs of green in their caps, they marched with grim pride, shouting their Gaelic battle cry, "Fawa Balla! Clear the way!" They charged into the storm, pressing close enough to hurl stones when ammunition ran low. But courage was no match for entrenched firepower. The Irish fell in ghastly numbers, their bodies lying in heaps where they had rushed the embankments. For 2 hours the slaughter raged, the lane filled with smoke, screams, and the relentless crack of musketry. Union men hurled themselves against the position, only to be driven back again and again. Yet inside the road, the Confederates were paying dearly too. Each volley cost them men they could not replace. Their line thinned with every passing minute. And then came confusion, a fatal misinterpretation. General Robert Rhodes, commanding part of the line, ordered a subordinate to shift position. The order was misunderstood as retreat. One regiment pulled back, then another, and within moments the entire position began unraveling. Panic spread down the trench. Seizing the moment, Union troops surged forward, clambering into the sunken road. What they found stunned even hardened veterans. The trench was choked with bodies, so thickly piled that men claimed they could walk from one end to the other without touching the ground. A Union officer described it as a ghastly harvest, furrows filled with the dead. The sunken road had earned a new name, Bloody Lane. The Union now had a hole torn in Lee's center. Sharpsburg itself lay within reach. But hesitation and uncertainty crept in once more. Instead of driving hard through the gap, the Federals halted, reformed, and waited for orders that never came. What could have been the breaking point of the Confederate Army became instead another moment lost. The road was won, but the victory lay buried beneath the corpses of thousands. While the Cornfield, the West Woods, and the Bloody Lane devoured thousands, the southern flank of the battlefield remained quiet. Here, Ambrose Burnside commanded the Union 9 Corps, tasked with striking across Antietam Creek and rolling up Lee's right. His mission was clear, his opportunity was golden. But Burnside hesitated, and with each passing hour, the chance for decisive victory ebbed away. McClellan had ordered Burnside to attack early that morning. Instead, Burnside lingered. He demanded clarifications, argued over the terrain, and shuffled his brigades without urgency. The sun rose higher, and still no assault came. One Union colonel fumed that Burnside sat upon his orders as though they were eggs he meant to hatch. The bridge before him was little more than a narrow stone arch, spanning the creek with deceptive grace. On the far side, barely 400 Georgians under Robert Toombs waited, their muskets sighted on the approaches. They had the high ground, and from it they could sweep the entire span with fire. When Burnside finally moved, it was nearly midday. His soldiers surged toward the bridge and were cut down in heaps. The stone arch became a funnel of death. Smoke clung to the creek, bullets whipped through the air, and the water itself ran red with blood. Men fell so thickly on the bridge that their bodies formed a grisly shield for those behind them. Again and again, the Union tried. Regiments charged with bayonets lowered, only to be ripped apart. An officer of the 51st Pennsylvania recalled, "We rushed forward shouting, but it was like running into a wall of flame. Soldiers broke ranks, diving into the creek to ford the water, clinging to rocks while musket balls skipped across the surface. Hours passed in this torment. Toombs's outnumbered brigade, starving, exhausted, but entrenched, held back thousands. They fought with the ferocity of men who knew the fate of Lee's army rested on their shoulders. Only after multiple failed assaults did Burnside finally succeed. A combined push across the bridge and a flanking move downstream forced Toombs to withdraw. The bridge was theirs at last, but by then it was nearly 1 p.m. 5 crucial hours lost. Burnside's delay had squandered the element of surprise and given Lee the gift of time. Time to brace, time to shift his few reserves, time to pray for the reinforcements racing north from Harper's Ferry. The bridge would forever carry Burnside's name, not as a monument to triumph, but as a reminder of how hesitation can turn opportunity into waste. At last, Burnside's corps surged across the stone bridge, banners rippling, drums beating. The narrow span that had cost so much now lay behind them. Ahead rose the ridges leading straight to Sharpsburg and to Robert E. Lee's exposed right. The moment McClellan had waited for since dawn was finally at hand, but time had already betrayed them. It was past 2 o'clock. The September sun hung heavy, its heat draining strength from men who had fought and marched since morning. Union soldiers collapsed on the far bank, drinking greedily from the creek still clouded with blood, some too spent to rise again. Even so, the corps reformed and pressed forward. Blue-coated ranks climbed the slopes, driving Confederate skirmishers back yard by yard. Union artillery rolled up in support, shells bursting among the ragged gray defenders. From the crest of the hill, the spires of Sharpsburg glimmered in sight. For a fleeting moment it seemed inevitable. The Union would sweep into the town, tear open Lee's flank, and trap the Army of Northern Virginia against the river. But the momentum was gone. Hours of costly delay had drained the advance of its thunder. Burnside's men moved not like a tidal wave, but like weary clusters, their attacks breaking into fits and starts. Regiments lost cohesion, tangled in farm fences and stone walls. Officers tried to urge them on, but even their voices carried more exhaustion than urgency. One private later wrote, "We knew victory lay ahead, but it felt like chasing a shadow. The harder we marched, the further it slipped away." On the Confederate side, Lee's right was little more than a skeleton. Cannon sat unmanned, reserves were gone, and the few defenders left clung desperately to fence rails and ridges. Had Burnside struck in the morning, he might have steamrolled through them. Now, though battered, they had been given time to brace, time to pray for salvation from Harper's Ferry. The battle had reached its hinge. Union soldiers crept closer to Sharpsburg, their muskets firing in ragged volleys, the town's rooftops visible through drifting smoke. But the decisive moment was not seized. Instead of a breakthrough, the afternoon slipped into a contest of endurance, with the fate of the field hanging in the balance. And on the southern horizon, a dust cloud began to rise. The sign that help, long prayed for, was coming. But not for McClellan. As Burnside's weary men climbed the slopes toward Sharpsburg, a new sound rose from the southern horizon, the steady rumble of boots on dirt, the clatter of muskets against canteens. A cloud of dust shimmered above the road from Harper's Ferry. Salvation was coming, for Lee. General A.P. Hill's Light Division had marched 17 miles in less than a day. Only 48 hours earlier, they had captured the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, seizing food, arms, and uniforms. Now, without rest, they were hurled north at breakneck speed. Soldiers staggered, many barefoot, their feet bleeding, but none dared fall out. "We knew the whole army depended on us," one private recalled. "Each step was torture, but no man left the line. Some wore captured Federal blue, adding eerie confusion to their ranks. From a distance, Union pickets mistook them for reinforcements, cheering until the rifles opened fire. Then came horror. The reinforcements were Confederates, arriving not to save the Union flank but to smash it. The timing was uncanny. Just as Burnside's corps began to roll into Sharpsburg, Hill's brigade slammed into their exposed left. Exhausted though they were, the Light Division fought like men possessed. Their volley tore through Burnside's regiments, already frayed by the ordeal at the bridge. Union officers shouted frantically to steady the line. Some regiments broke and ran, others turned to fight, colliding with Hill's men in savage close quarters. Bayonets clashed, muskets fired at point-blank range, and the fields filled with smoke and screams. The shock of fresh Confederates appearing at the very instant of supposed victory sent a chill through the Union advance. One Pennsylvania soldier later wrote, "We thought Lee beaten at last when suddenly new devils fell upon us, as if the earth had opened and spewed them out. Burnside had lost his chance. Hours of delay at the creek had allowed Lee's reinforcements to arrive. Instead of a breakthrough, the southern flank dissolved into stalemate, with neither side able to push the other off the blood-soaked ridges. Lee's army had been saved not by brilliance, but by endurance, by men who marched themselves to exhaustion and still found the will to fight." In A.P. Hill's division, Robert E. Lee found his reprieve, and McClellan, once more, found the opportunity slipping through his grasp. By late afternoon, Antietam was no longer a contest of maneuver. It was a contest of survival. The Cornfield was a wasteland of corpses, the West Woods a killing ground, the Bloody Lane a trench overflowing with the dead. And now, on the southern slopes, Burnside's advance had been checked by A.P. Hill's furious counterstroke. For the soldiers still standing, the battlefield felt unreal. Men moved like shadows through a haze of smoke, deafened by hours of cannon fire, numb to the sight of friends lying sprawled in grotesque stillness. It seemed, one Union veteran later wrote, as if the very earth groaned beneath us. Lee's army was at the breaking point. His divisions were gutted, many officers killed, every reserve committed. Yet Sharpsburg still held. Lee himself rode among his soldiers, calm, composed, a figure of iron in the twilight. To his men, his mere presence was enough to keep them rooted in place. On the Union side, exhaustion reigned. Regiments that had begun the day with full strength now counted barely half their numbers. Men slumped against fence rails, too weary to lift their muskets. Others dropped where they stood, sleeping amidst the bodies of the fallen. The will to attack again had bled away with the sun. As dusk fell, the noise ebbed into silence, broken only by the cries of the wounded. Thousands lay between the lines, calling for water, for mothers, for mercy. Soldiers crept into the no-man's land, carrying comrades back on blankets or simply sitting with them as they died. In Sharpsburg itself, civilians emerged cautiously from cellars. They found fences splintered by cannonballs, walls riddled with bullets, wells fouled with corpses. A local farmer wrote, "Every barn was a hospital, every home a morgue. Neither side had won. Neither side could fight on." The great clash had ended not in triumph or disaster, but in a dreadful equilibrium, a silence more terrible than the noise that came before. The bloodiest day in American history closed not with the trumpet of victory, but with the moan of the dying and the heavy darkness of a night that brought no peace. The dawn of September 18th rose gray and heavy over Sharpsburg. Both armies still faced one another across the same torn fields, but the fighting spirit was gone. Robert E. Lee, ever defiant, told his officers he would stand and fight again if McClellan attacked. Yet his army was a shadow of itself. Divisions reduced to fragments, many regiments barely 100 strong. His men had fought themselves to exhaustion. McClellan, for his part, chose caution. His artillery lined the ridges, his infantry entrenched, but he did not press the attack. He convinced himself that Lee had hidden reserves, that another advance might lead to disaster. In truth, the Confederate army was near collapse, but McClellan, as so often, erred on the side of restraint. That night, under cover of darkness, Lee slipped back across the Potomac. The invasion of Maryland was over. The numbers were staggering. In just 12 hours of combat, more than 22,700 Americans had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. No other single day in U.S. history has matched the slaughter of Antietam. Cornfields, farm lanes, and bridges became charnel grounds. Civilians who emerged after the battle found their homes filled with the dead. It was as if death had swept the land with a broom, one Sharpsburg resident wrote. And yet, from this horrific stalemate came a turning point. Abraham Lincoln, who had been waiting for a victory to strengthen his hand, seized the moment. Within days, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The war was no longer only about preserving the Union. It was about ending slavery. This shift echoed across the Atlantic. Britain and France, long tempted to recognize the Confederacy, recoiled. To back Lee's government now would be to endorse human bondage. The Confederacy's last real hope for foreign support withered in the smoke of Antietam. For the soldiers who survived, the meaning was simpler: survival itself. They carried with them memories that would haunt them for life. The cornfield where men fell as thick as stalks, the bloody lane where bodies lay stacked like cordwood, the bridge where the creek ran red. A veteran of the Irish Brigade later said, "I saw men fall in heaps, as if mown by the hand of God." Antietam ended as neither victory nor defeat. It was something stranger, a bloody draw that reshaped the war's course, a day when the Union did not triumph, but the Confederacy failed to win. From its ashes, the Union found the resolve to fight on, while the Confederacy lost the chance to change history with one bold stroke. The bloodiest day in American history had not ended the Civil War, but it had changed it forever.